Well, we welcome you to another installment of Ministers Joe and Josh Discuss. We're at the end of chapter 22 of Genesis today. So we are in Genesis chapter 22, and this is verse 20. We probably won't deal too much with this end part, but just to be comprehensive, I guess we've decided we're going through every verse of Genesis, so we might as well read them. That okay with you?
Sure.
You want to read these since there's so many fun names in it?
No, I think you'll do better.
All right, let's see how I do. I should be reading this in Hebrew. I'll be better off. Now, after these things, and remember where we were last week, was the sacrifice of Isaac and Abraham's willingness to do that, and God's revelation that that's not something he was asking. Verse 20. Now, after these things, it was told Abraham, Milcah also has borne children to your brother Nahor. Uz, the firstborn, Buz, probably Booz, something like that, his brother, Kemuel, the father of Aram, Chesed, you know that word,
Yeah.
Hatzo, Pildash, Jidlaph, and Betuel. Betuel became the father of Rebekah. These 8 Milcah bore to Nahor, Abraham's brother. Moreover, his concubine, whose name was Rumah, bore Tibah, Gaham, Tahash, and Maacah. So that's a lot of names.
Oh, yeah.
We're not going to talk through this, but just to mention one, I just mentioned Uz because that's the town that Job was from, right? Wasn't he from Uz?
Uz?
Am I wrong about that?
I'm not recalling that right off the moment.
You'll look that up, Minister Joe, I'm sure.
I think I have to, yeah, because you're always carrying the heavy water.
But anyway, we won't deal too much with those names, but all of those names become significant in one way or another in the narrative of Genesis or into Exodus. You'll see some of them get rehashed. But this will become important in just a chapter or so when Isaac is seeking a wife, and Abraham will send his servant back to his homeland. So it's preparatory for that anyway.
Yep, Job is from Uz. You're correct. I found that quickly like that. See, real quick.
Look at that. Yeah, you were lightning. See that? Yeah,
Short
so he's
girl.
from Uz. I don't really know if that relates at all, but I've been told in my undergraduate, sometimes you just get told things in a lecture that I've never had occasion to look up and see if they were true. But I remember a professor lecturing and saying that the length of Job's life would put him in the time of the patriarchs. The time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because the length of his life is similar to the lengths of theirs. And so many think he was contemporary. I mean, there are people who think Job is a made-up story. You run into them all the time. But for those who think it was historical, many think he would have been contemporary with Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob, somewhere in that time frame. And if he lived in Uz, maybe he's a relative. Tough to say. But anyway, that's as much as we'll deal with those names, unless something jumped out to you, Minister Joe, you want to mention.
Well, I noticed there was a buzz in there.
Yeah. I'd have to see that in Hebrew. It would be pronounced booze. I'm not sure. That's no better, is it?
Probably not.
All right. Well, let's move on to chapter 23, which is the heart of our discussion today.
Unless you had a lot of problem with wine, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. I don't know when they started being called booze either. So, anyway, maybe it's his namesake. Genesis 23 verse 1 says, Sarah lived 127 years. This was the length of Sarah's life. And Sarah died at Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. Abraham rose up from beside his dead and said to the Hittites, I'm a stranger and an alien residing among you. Give me property among you for a burying place, so that I may bury my dead out of my sight. The Hittites answered Abraham, Hear us, my lord. You are a mighty prince among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our burial places. None of us will withhold from you any burial ground for burying your dead. Abraham rose and bowed to the Hittites, the people of the land. He said to them, If you are willing that I should bury my dead out of my sight, hear me, and entreat for me Ephron, son of Zohar, so that he may give me the cave of Machpelah, which he owns. It's at the end of his field. For the full price, let him give it to me in your presence as a possession for a burying place. Now Ephron was sitting among the Hittites. And Ephron the Hittite answered Abraham in the hearing of the Hittites, of all who went in at the gate of his city. No, my lord, hear me. I give you the field, and I give you the cave that's in it. In the presence of my people, I give it to you. Bury your dead. Then Abraham bowed down before the people of the land. He said to Ephron in the hearing of the people of the land, if you only will listen to me, I will give the price of the field. Accept it from me, so that I may bury my dead there. Ephron answered Abraham, my lord, listen to me. A piece of land worth 400 shekels of silver. What is that between you and me? Bury your dead. Abraham agreed with Ephron, and Abraham weighed out for Ephron the silver that he had named in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 shekels of silver, according to the weights current among the merchants. So the field of Ephron in Machpelah, which was to the east of Mamre, the field with the cave that was in it, and all the trees that were in the field, throughout its whole area, passed to Abraham as a possession in the presence of the Hittites, in the presence of all who went in at the gate of his city. After this, Abraham buried Sarah his wife in the cave of the field of Machpelah, facing Mamre, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. The field and the cave that is in it passed from the Hittites into Abraham's possession as a burying place. That's a lot of detail, wouldn't you say?
Oh, yeah. A lot of communication, a lot of silver.
Yeah, you've got that
I wonder
right.
how he carried all that. That's a lot of silver.
Yeah, it is. I mean, a shekel, do you know, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head how much a shekel weighs, but I know it weighs quite a bit.
Yeah. Let me check. See if I can find real quick.
You check that, and I'm going to show our people where we are on the map.
Please do.
All right, so last time Abraham made an agreement that got him some land was down here near Beersheba in the south, right? So he gets a well there, and he plants a tree, a tamarisk tree. And we talked about that the last time. And this is the region that Ishmael remains in, and Isaac spends most of his time down here in Beersheba. But at the time that Sarah dies, we're up a little further north. So we're between Beersheba and Salem, where Melchizedek is king, and in the hills of which Abraham had just sacrificed Isaac, or was willing to when God spared him. So now we're in between. We're in Hebron. Hebron gets known later. It's the city that David first rules from when he becomes king over Israel. His first capital is in Hebron for a few years before he conquers the city of Salem and renames it Jerusalem. So here we are, a little further north. You notice a different people group is involved. So when he was in Beersheba down here, he was dealing with Abimelech, and it was called the region of the Philistines. You remember that?
Oh, yeah.
But now we're in the region of the Hittites. Now what's interesting, the Hittites are from way north. They're a very powerful empire in the region of what was called Asia Minor in the First Testament. We would call it Turkey today for the most part. And they're from up that northern region, but they're very strong, and they are controlling Israel. Now, it's probably worth saying this because this is a very highly diplomatic and geopolitical passage, so we might as well deal with that. Mm-hmm. Israel has often been called by scholars a land bridge. Reason for that, I know it's a little bit light, but the major superpowers of the day were, of course, Egypt, which is here, the Hittites, which are here, the Babylonians, which are in the Fertile Crescent, so they're over near the Tigris and Euphrates River. They're going to be around here. And then the Persians are going to be up here and a little bit further east. And these are going to be the major superpowers of the day. Now, of course, they have to trade with each other. And so this is the Saudi Arabian desert. It's pretty much unpassable, at least by a general caravan. You're not going to travel goods across there. So in order for Egypt to interact with these others, they've got to cross this little strip of land that has water, and it has trade routes. The Mediterranean Sea, they could trade there as well, but it's dangerous, lots of storms and things like that. Seafaring isn't particularly strong in these days, and there are pirates. Mm-hmm. So this becomes the most sought after piece of real estate in the ancient world because it connected all the ancient superpowers. It was a natural land bridge. It had water, and it could be settled. So when the Hittites are in power, they extend their power into this region. When the Egyptians are powerful, they extend their reach into this region. When the Persians are powerful, they come in. When the Babylonians, everybody wanted to control this little strip of land. So the Lord put his people in a very important geographical location for the ancient world. And one of the things we're learning in the story here is that Abraham is setting up little pieces of property on one of the major trade routes. So these cities are in a route that runs through the hill country. Now there's a more prominent trade route that is along the coast, but Abraham's staying away from there. That's going to be where the Philistines settle in the days of David and later on in Israelite history. And this is a major trade route. It's the easiest one to travel because you have to deal with the hills. But Abram is setting up a foothold. So anyway, that's just geopolitically. This is a very geopolitical passage. So we might as well know our history. So you were going to see how much a shekel weighed.
Yeah, shekel is equivalent to 2 bekahs, and then that's 2/5 of an ounce.
Okay, 2/5 of an ounce.
So seems kind of random to me.
Yeah, well, it's probably based on a measurement that's different than us, but that means you're going to roughly get 2.5 shekels per ounce.
Or 11.5 grams per shekel.
Yeah, but when you move from ounces to grams, you're switching units there.
Oh yeah. Well, I do, my weight scale for my food at home, it can do that. So you always feel like you're getting so much more when you're getting a gram there. It's like
grams. I know, like an ounce is like 85 grams or something like that, right?
Crazy stuff.
Yeah. So I mean, 400 shekels is what, about 200 ounces. So it's not light.
No. I'm just surprised he was carrying it around in his little satchel there.
Well, remember, he's traveling with all of his people, so
I guess
he's probably got some animals carrying that stuff.
Oh yeah, there you go.
Now, if Sarah's with him, then everybody's with him. Right, because she died there.
It must have been pretty hard.
Yeah, we were talking about this before we started recording, but Sarah is 127. When she dies, she's about 90 when Isaac is born, so he's about 37 years old now. So fully a man, has been a man for a long time. Funny enough, not married yet, which is weird. Yeah. Well, maybe they're going to go back in time. No, they're not. He waited a long time to get married. But yeah, it's got to be hard for Abraham. I mean, Sarah's been his traveling companion throughout his entire life. And they've been through a lot together. And he goes in to mourn for her. We don't know. In the ancient Near East, mourning is much more organized than ours. It lasts a certain period of time. There are certain decorum on how to interact with someone who's in mourning. Even Jewish people today do something called sitting Shiva, I think is what it's called. I could be wrong about the pronunciation though, where they sit with a person in mourning for 7 days. So if somebody's lost a loved one, they're not left alone for 7 days. People in their family are on shifts to sit with them regularly as they mourn. So we tend to come from the West where emotionality is poo-pooed. And generally, if you're a man, you're supposed to have a stiff upper lip and you're supposed to control your emotions. And that's considered very masculine and very strong. It's becoming less so, I think. I think younger generations, mine, yours, and the ones behind us, are a little more apt to be emotional. But in the older generations, the belief of a stiff upper lip was pretty strong. That's a very Western thing. Comes from a philosophy called Stoicism. And maybe a little bit from the Greek philosophers who believed that hyper emotionality was very feminine, which they thought of as negative. And it was also somewhat animalistic. They thought of it as animalistic. So might be a little strange for us to see that Abraham is, you'll see this in the scriptures a lot, this open weeping, open mourning, much more emotional. The men of the Bible, much more emotional. David is a classic example of someone who's very emotional. but that can seem somewhat foreign to us. I don't know about you, Minister Joe. Were you raised to believe that masculinity was less emotional than femininity?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
But I think you know, that when I begin to think about what Abraham experienced, um, my I start to sympathize with them. What's the feeling? I mean, I can't imagine. Well, I don't want to imagine like that to have my wife. That's what comes through my mind when I read this passage.
Yeah. Yeah. You identify with him. Yeah. Be so hard. And Abraham goes into mourn and he weeps for her. That was what I was talking about. You see, Jesus weeps in the scriptures too. That would not have been strange. Like men of this culture would openly weep. We tend to think of it as undignified. Like if you ever see a European ancestry person, the instinct is, even if we're crying, to try and keep ourselves as dignified as possible. You might see the tears, but we really try and fight any kind of distortion to the face or any open weeping. Because our tradition, which goes back to Plato and Socrates, would say that that's undignified, that a man has to always be dignified. You even see that in pastoral ministry. I remember being told that there was the expectation that pastors would even mow their lawn in suits in the middle of the summer so they would never be seen improperly dressed. This idea of decorum, very, very, very high value in the West. But you'll notice as you read the scriptures that it's a little different. The sensibilities are different in other cultures. And so the fact that Abraham's weeping here, you might be tempted to think, wow, this must have hit him hard if he's openly weeping. But that's because you're a European. It's because you're an American. This would have been expected. And so I'm not saying he didn't feel it deeply, but the language is not meant to indicate that something's really wrong. Yeah.
Yeah, I can't help but think, because it's not been too long that we talked about the about Sodom and Gomorrah and with Lot. There is this contrast again. I mean, you don't hear much from Lot after his wife is turned to salt.
Yeah.
And so you remember Lot's wife that way, but you also I immediately think here. Not immediately, but maybe it's a thought that came to my mind, is that the contrast between the reactions between Lot and Abraham.
Yeah, the grieving is very different. Of course, Lot's loss is more traumatic.
Yeah, catastrophic.
And clearly judgment. And he didn't have a body to bury.
Right.
Lot grieves in his own way. He more or less falls apart, becomes depressed, and hides in a cave. But Abraham is a little bit more maybe culturally healthy in the way he processes this and goes about things.
Yeah, and that we can't help but think about the contrast.
Yeah, you're right. I agree with you. I hadn't really thought about it till you said it, but you're right. There's quite a contrast. Even Abraham's response to the loss of Sodom and Gomorrah is pretty different than this.
Right. I mean, Lot couldn't even look back at his wife.
Yeah.
So I'm surprised that he even knew that she turned into a pillar of salt. It must have been after.
Yeah. It's always difficult when you're dealing with the Bible because it does present itself as eyewitnesses, and we know that many of these stories were passed down orally. But it's always a struggle to figure out exactly how Moses brought it all together and wrote. Does God ever give him a God's eye view of how things happened, or is he always just dealing with witness testimony that was passed down through stories? Scholars debate that, but you run into these details that you think God is the only one who would have known this, like creation, for instance.
Yeah, right.
So God might have filled in some of the details for him, or maybe they went back later and found her, and it's
the tag around her neck said "Mom."
I don't know. We don't even know her name. Yeah.
But I thought for a moment too, Lot might have thought she ran off.
He could have, right? Yeah, we're not privy to Lot's mind almost about anything, even with his daughters and those weird stuff that happened there. We don't really get anything from Lot.
Either way, it's not the contrast is the same.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, there's no doubt. And then Abraham is going to enter into a contract. Now, these treaties are really important. They're called, well, it depends on who's making them, but I was taught them as suzerainty treaties because they're often made between a king and their people. But the Hittites are famous for this, as were the Babylonians later, at having very formal contract negotiations that resulted in formal covenants that had very specific stipulations. The Hittites are the first nation in the Middle East that we have a lot of documented evidence that they use these treaties all the time. And it's clearly demarcated here. And one of the questions we have to ask to deal with this passage well is why record this? And that's probably the question of our discussion today. Why is this in the scripture? But these Hittite treaties, they form the foundation of the covenant of Sinai. The covenant of Sinai, now it depends on when you think Genesis, Exodus were written. Some folks believe that they were entirely written during the exile, when the Israelites were in exile in Babylon. And people who believe that the form of the covenant of Sinai has been influenced by the Babylonian treaties. But my education was a little more conservative and a little bit more willing to accept the fact that much of the traditions that led to Genesis and Exodus actually date to the times in which they claim. And if that's the case, then the covenant of Sinai is shaped by the Hittite order, which is very similar to the Babylonian anyway. It'd be hard to tell the difference between them. I mean, they're clearly, the Babylonians were influenced by the Hittites. But this kind of negotiation, once you see it laid out, if you go to the negotiation God has with Abraham on Sinai, you'll see a lot of parallels.
You mean Moses?
Moses, yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah. You had me confused for a second there.
Yeah, I'm glad you caught it. Everybody else would have been confused too. But yes, the negotiation God has with Moses on Sinai it sounds a lot like this kind of back and forth. And once you understand that, like when God says to Moses, I'm going to wipe out the Israelites and bring a nation from you. That's not that different than this guy saying, you can have the cave. I don't need it. It's part of the negotiation. So in some ways, God is willing to interact with us based on our culture. But we have to be careful not to think that he's authorizing the culture just because he's willing to engage with us in the culture. I'm not saying that the Hittite treaties are like sacred, but this is what Abraham would have known. And it's what Moses knew, being an Egyptian, influenced by these treaties. So anyway, it might be here in part to help us understand the way the contracts are made in the scriptures and to show that Abraham understood it.
Yeah.
It's more than that, but I'm just saying it's at least that.
Yeah, and then also the dignity of the dead, dealing with the dead and what.
That's right. Yep. Abraham is insistent that he wants to bury Sarah. And that's not a foregone conclusion in every culture in the ancient Near East. We certainly know that there were funeral pyres in some cultures and others that other cultures today that will leave the dead out to be scavenged by animals. But Abraham is showing a sensitivity for burial, which I think is probably Sumerian, probably his culture, but something that God also asks of the people in Exodus. Yeah. So what we do with our dead is very culturally conditioned. One of the things that's happening in our day, I don't know how you feel about this, Minister Joe, there was a time where Christians were very opposed to cremation. And now it's becoming very common among Christians to cremate. But a lot of that is cultural sensitivities. Right.
Yeah. I've heard some people that are definitely opposed to being cremated, thinking that their bodies in the next life, or when the Lord comes, that they won't be able to rise up because their bodies have been burned. And
Right.
I said, if God can make man from dirt, I think he can make it from dust.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's about the same process, I would imagine. But yeah, I mean, the law of Moses allows for cremation. I guess maybe that came to maybe that made a negative connotation that only criminals ever had their bodies burned. But I think it was more a matter of convenience. I think the principle of the law of Moses is God expects bodies either to be buried or to be burned, but never to be left out. That's the way I read it. So I don't have a particular moral issue with cremation, but it should be observed that the normal process of burial is very consistent with what we see in the Abraham story, is bodily burial. And for Jewish people, even today, no embalming, as quickly as possible and with all bodily fluids. So if somebody dies on a set of sheets, the sheets are buried with them in Judaism, but no embalming or any attempt to delay the decay process or anything, just buried. And Jewish tradition today is that they have to be buried in a pine box with no metal, and they're supposed to be very plain, because rich and poor are the same in death. So you have some of those traditions carry on, but I wouldn't say any of those are inspired. But we do see it here in Abraham. And he doesn't want to bury her on Canaanite land. What do you make about that?
Yeah, well,
I mean, it's Hittites are controlling it, but this is the region of.
right. Yeah. Well, I think there's that he's living there. He still calls himself a foreigner or a stranger. He still considers himself not to be one of them.
Yep.
You wonder how long you got to live somewhere before you're one of them.
He's been here a long time, right? I mean, they've been in the land now for, I think they were in for 20 some odd years before Isaac was born. It's been at least 37 years since he was born. So we're talking nearly 60 years in this land. He still calls himself a foreigner.
Right. And yeah, it makes you wonder, I mean, some places, how long you have to be somewhere before you're considered one of them.
See, I don't know how you take it, but I take this as a identity discussion more so than a habitation discussion. He's clearly lived here for a long enough time that you would consider him part of this area. But ideologically, he is not part of them at all. He worships a God they don't worship. At least most of them don't. We know that Melchizedek does. Salem seems to still be worshiping the God who reveals himself to Abraham, but most of them don't. Mm-hmm. So he's kind of religiously separate. He's ethically separate. Mm-hmm. And so I think his calling himself a stranger has more to do with the fact that he's not identifying with the ethics of this place, more so than it does with where he lives.
Yeah.
I mean, what do you think?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, he's distancing himself in that way. He said, hey, can you at least give me a space to bury my wife? I'm trying to understand a little bit the idea of the cave in the field. Typically, if you were to bury somebody, I would thought it would be in the ground, not. But I guess you could consider a cave a type of the ground.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's kind of an interesting thought. But he's definitely not. He's distancing himself from them, and I'm not really sure what it would be interesting to know more about how the Hittites actually dealt with their dead.
Yeah, my instinct is that he wants to be free to bury her any way he wants, rather than according to Hittite custom. I think that's the sense here, that he's, if I had to guess, that's what I would think. Because, if anybody who's had to bury someone that they love, if you go to a funeral home and you say, we'd like to do this, we'd like to do that, some of it's dictated what you're allowed to do based on that funeral parlor and what they're comfortable with. And if you go to a church and you want to do your funeral service there, that will be dictated. I know, like the Church of the Nazarene in the manual doesn't like secret societies. You can't be a member of a secret society and be a member of the Church of the Nazarene. So there are certain burial rites that happen at funeral services for people who are part of secret societies, like the Masons, for instance. And that generally is not done in a Nazarene church because of the belief system. So you know, what you're allowed to do and not allowed to do does have to do with your location. And there might be a sense here that Abraham doesn't want to have to deal with any of the Hittite practices or whatever the local customs are. He may just want to deal with this on his own. And in order to do that, he's going to have to own the property.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So it could be that. I mean, we're speculating to a degree, but this is not the reason this text is here is probably not to give us that information, but it's worth talking about.
Right. Right. Yeah. I think that the degree is ownership. Like they say, I forget where I've heard it before in sermons or whatever, but when an army tries to take conquest or take a place, you have to have a beachfront or head, I think they call it. Yeah. And I think that's probably where this text is really pointing us toward, that in order for Abraham to have offspring or to become that great nation, this is the beginning in a lot of ways of establishing, like you said before, we talked about the tamarisk tree where the well was. This is the beginning of the nation. Yeah. Even though it sounds really strange to us because it's burying his wife, who's been with him all this time. He's old, pretty old fella.
Yeah.
And yet you're thinking in your mind, like, well, how is this the beginning when he's buying a field in a cave? But there's futuristic that were ramifications for the future. Yeah. that are built into this.
This is going to be a burial place for many of his descendants.
Right. And so it's pretty much that beachhead of our establishment. I mean, you pointed out in the mapping that the Hittite people came from above and came down. So they were, in some ways, maybe he was kind of even mocking them by saying, I'm the foreigner here, but in reality, you're the foreigner and this is my place.
Yeah. You never know. I mean, the Hittites are as deeply south as they are because this is a trade route.
Yeah.
And it sounds like some of the coastal areas were hard to take, which might be why they didn't get that trade route that's along the coast. They called it earlier in the book Philistine territory. So that might have been somewhat resistant to them, but they've come deep into the hill country down to Hebron because it's a trade route. So in some ways, they're both sort of foreigners here. The Hittites are not native Canaanites.
Right.
So it is an interesting, ironic story where two people who don't originate in this region are negotiating over property rights.
Right. And the other section that we're talking about is that's actually the modern day Gaza Strip, right? And they're still fighting over that today, aren't they?
Yeah, that's the Gaza Strip is where the Philistines were in David's day, and it seems to be where Abimelech is in control. Must have been a pretty decent king.
Right.
Yeah, it's still being fought about for very different reasons, though. Now it's about history and legacy and rights of inheritance, whereas in these days it was really about trade routes. But now with planes and boats, and Israel is not necessary for all the superpowers to trade anymore. But in those days it was.
Is that the rights and heritage have to do with Abraham?
Abraham and World War II, really. The fallout from World War II and the way in which the Western colonial powers carved up the Middle East as they saw fit. And many of the people who live there still feel that was all done unjustly. And of course, Israel claims to have an ancient stake in this area, which we know is true. But that's what I mean. It's kind of a last hanging on of imperialism, of European imperialism that still is bearing fruit of war in the Middle East.
Yeah, so it's still very complicated, but even in that time, it was just as complicated.
Right.
major
Yeah,
trade area.
because before World War I and II, the Ottoman Empire had ruled this region, a Muslim empire for forever. I mean, 600, 800 years, something like that, a long time. So when that empire fell and the Europe took it over, it created the modern disputes. So the modern disputes are not quite what the ancient disputes were. The ancient disputes were socio-political, based mostly on trade routes and wealth, the movement of wealth.
Yeah.
Nowadays, it's about something else. Yeah, yeah. But we're still fighting over the same region.
Mhm.
You know, it's still, I say we, but the world is still very focused on this same region. So God really knew how to pick a location. Now, why do you think this long negotiation following very specific Hittite rules has been recorded for us in Genesis? Do you have a sense of why, like, Moses felt this needed to be included?
Well, you did glimpse to it earlier, and I haven't decided whether I agree with you or not, but because I'd have to know some more information. I guess I'm not having
Yeah.
that enlightenment yet. But to think that this is a process in which that they were to learn to understand the negotiation of the law.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I would not if you thought I was saying that this passage is preserved to teach them how to make a covenant. I'm not saying that.
It's just reflective.
But I am saying it's reflective of the covenants of these days and gets reflected again on Sinai. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's there's some basic stuff that I would say it's that maybe far stretching would be more along the lines of the fact that there was there's a finality to relationships to be you sense. I mean, maybe I shouldn't name names, but there's certain couples that I've seen that are very elderly.
Yeah.
And when I see them interact with each other, I say to myself, that is what I want to be when I'm that age.
Yeah.
Caring for the one that God is. Maybe that's just much too personal to say or something. I don't know, but it just seems like that reflects how God treats us or wants us to be together. And so the I guess it's the dignity of life that I see there, the respect, the honor, even though even though Abraham and Sarah had their moments where they did some things, or there might have been some bitterness or frustrations with the way Abraham responded to Sarah, or some of the things that happened in Egypt or Abimelech or all these other places. There's always those stories, but the dignity of life, of knowing that Abraham, and I think it says it's reflective in the marriage of Rebecca and Isaac, that they love each other.
Yeah.
And I think that's pretty vital. I mean, I've been married 30 years, and I want people to think or to say someday as a legacy. One of the songs that we had at our wedding was "Find Us Faithful." It was a popular song at the time.
Yeah. Steve Green.
Yeah, we would like to believe that when people look at our marriage, they would say that. And I tend to feel like that's what's going on here, is that he was faithful
Abraham is honoring Sarah.
Yeah, faithful to the end, and respecting her potential wishes, and
making sure she's properly cared for, properly buried. Yep.
Yeah, so I tend to feel like that's part of it. There may be more that I just don't get right at the moment. Yeah, no thoughts. But
yeah, I think that's a valid concern. You see it in Jesus too, like when he's on the cross and he makes sure that the Apostle John knows that Jesus wants him to care for Jesus' earthly mother, for Mary. There's this idea of ongoing care of one's family as part of the responsibility. And I've often said to folks when we've done funerals that their loved one walked with them, and now the rest of the walk they have to take for them. And you remember there was great concern over Jesus' body, that it was properly cared for, that it was following the law. You see that with Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, and then the women who come to the tomb to make sure it's all properly handled. So caring for those who have departed is, I guess what you're pointing out there, is a long biblical tradition of concern, that this is a continued way of love, a continued way of showing loyalty.
And yet it's very different than some of the beliefs of like Egypt, where they embalmed them. They expected that they were coming into another life, that or reincarnation, where they thought they were going to come out better or worse than how they lived.
Yeah, it's very difficult to say what Abraham would have believed, because of course he was Sumerian. He came from the city of Ur, and all the ancient cultures had various beliefs about the afterlife. You mentioned the Egyptians, would certainly believed in life after death, at least for the wealthy, at least for the powerful, at least for the pharaohs. Now, whether they believe that for the average person is another question entirely. But they certainly thought of the pharaohs as semi-divine, if not full right demigods. And they thought of them as living forever, and certainly the wealthy got into that. And the Sumerians might have had some conception of life after death, with the possibility of immortality. So I don't know what Abraham would have thought, but you don't have any real sense here that he's doing anything to guarantee an afterlife for Sarah.
Right.
Like, you don't get any sense of that. But you do get a sense of the sacredness of the ground, which is a very strong ancient Near Eastern belief. And you can see this in, say, do you remember the story of Naaman? Naaman is how I was taught, but I think his name is pronounced Naaman in Hebrew. And he comes and he's unclean. And I think he comes to Elisha, but Elisha doesn't talk to him. And he wants to be healed. He hears there's a prophet, and Elisha, through his own servant, tells him to go wash in the Jordan River 7 times, right? And Naaman doesn't take very kindly to that, because he thinks there are better rivers where he comes from. So he starts to leave, but then his own servants sort of urge him, saying, well, you came all the way here. Why not just do it, right? And he does. He bathes, and he's healed. Mm-hmm. And then he wants to go back and give tribute to Elisha, and Elisha refuses any money. And then after he leaves, Elisha's servant surreptitiously goes and says, my master made a mistake. We'll take the money. And he takes it, and then he ends up getting punished for it. But what I want to point out, I say the whole story just to say that Naaman wants to take ground from Israel and take it back with him. He wants to take earth from Israel. And the reason that is in the ancient world, they believed gods were associated with the ground. So the gods were very geographically located. And so there's also a sense here, and I think this might be one of the biggest reasons this is preserved for us, is to insist that Abraham would never have buried his dead in the territory of pagan deities. That's a strong belief in the ancient Near East. And so by purchasing this and having a legal contract for it, Abraham is being given this property, and it's no longer under jurisdiction of the Hittite gods. It's been legally given to Abraham. And I think that's very, very important. And the reason that most of Abraham's descendants will be buried in this cave is for those reasons. Because Abraham is serving Yahweh, a unique God that is not the God of the other pagan nations. Mm-hmm. And I think the transfer of land has to do with the transfer of authority.
It probably could be equated with the concept of sanctification.
Yeah. We don't think of spiritual beings as being associated with land, but that is a pervasive belief of the ancient Near East, certainly of the Sumerian Empire where Abraham came from, and certainly the Canaanites. So, and God speaks to them in that language, the sacredness of the land of Israel. That's why Naaman wants to take, he says that he goes into he serves a guy who worships other gods, and because he serves him, he's going to have to go in the temple of other gods, but he wants to have this earth from Israel with him. He has this idea that as long as he does that, he's not betraying the God of Elisha, because he's got land, he's got dirt from that place. So Anyway, I think that's probably the heart of this story, is that Abraham is making sure that his dead, because Sarah's the first of his household to die.
Right.
At least narratively. We don't know if he had servants who died or whatnot. You assume he might have, but none of that is narrated. So he needs a place to bury her, and he does not want her buried under the jurisdiction of these other nations. And I think that has to do with their gods.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah.
I can buy that.
Yeah. So I think that's part of it. And of course, we should never diminish the reality that it's important to the people of Israel to establish the ancientness of the claim that they have on the Holy Land. And so you're writing the book of the law. Remember, Genesis is part of the book of the law. It's also establishing the right of Israel to live in this land. Because remember, they're coming back to the land after being 450 years in slavery. So any legal documentation that they have to prove that they actually were here before will be important to claiming that they have a legitimate right to be there. And so this is probably also recorded as a way of recording a contract made with Abraham that predates. I mean, this is in Abraham's life. So they might be saying, hey, we made this treaty with the Hittites, who by the time of Moses are waning. By the time of Joshua, they're barely a presence in the land. So claiming they had a treaty with the Hittites is another way of saying our claim on this land is older than yours. So we probably shouldn't diminish the fact that that's here too. Just like the well in Beersheba.
Right.
You know, property disputes are all about who was here first.
Yeah.
You know, so that might be part of it as well. Why Moses wanted to make sure it was here. Because remember, they're going, when Moses writes this, they're going into this land to take it. And they haven't been there for 450 years.
Right.
So claiming they actually own that cave will be a pretty, you're going to have some documentation.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. But once they get in there, they bring Joseph here, the bones of Joseph, remember? So, you know, it seems like a very insignificant story, right? You read it and you're like, why is this here? But there's a lot of importance.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And I think you're right. The way Abraham honors Sarah is important. And I think, I don't know about you, but in recent days, there's been this move to not do anything for loved ones when they pass. Like I know I lost an aunt just recently, one of my great aunts, and the family just decided they didn't want to do anything. Like no memorial service, no, they might do something at the graveside maybe later. But I've noticed that that's becoming more recurrent, and probably part of it is because of the expense of funerals, which have gotten out of control. I never charge anybody to do a funeral. I figure it's part of my responsibility. But I do understand it gets very expensive, and some people make a living at this, so I'm not saying it should be free. But I've noticed this move to not do anything, and it's hard for me not to feel that there's some lack of chesed there, to not carry people all the way through with dignity.
Yeah. Well, I've told people more recently that it's vital to be able to communicate with those you love, no matter how maybe you don't love them, maybe they're just relatives, but it's vital to know the wishes of what people want, just to honor them. I mean, constantly of the command talking about honoring your parents, and that it not for the benefit that it will all go well for you. I mean, that's
yeah.
But the reality is, if you don't know what they will because you refuse to talk to them, or they don't have a will that's clear, that's a sad thing. Just out of respect for them, there's nothing superstitious about whether or not they're gonna. I mean, some cultures talk about people coming back to haunt them, and
that's not Christian. There are Christians who believe that, but that's not Christian.
I mean, all that stuff is extra, but the basic need of honoring. I mean, like, you know, I probably hadn't shared with you, maybe this would be an edit point. I don't know, but my dad the last time he visited, we had a series of good opportunities to discuss how he's doing and our future and what he's thinking. And found it very comforting to know that he has things that worked out, and that he's able to communicate that.
Yeah.
So I felt good about that. I was able to, and I felt responsible in some degree because I believe that's part of honoring my father. So knowing what they wanted is valuable to respect. What I'm referring to.
Yeah, and we believe this is part of our Christian beliefs, and we get it from the Jewish people, the people of Israel before us, that humans are sacred, that we're not just like the animals, though we share a lot in common with them in the flesh. We are meant to be God's image bearers on earth. We are meant to be God's representatives. And so the scriptures from the law of Moses on always taught that the bodies of the dead must be treated with respect, that are consistent with our uniqueness among the creatures of the earth, that we should not be treated just like any other animal. And that is why one of the reasons the law of Moses prohibited the leaving out of a human body to be preyed on by animals. It needed to be properly cared for. And I'm not saying we need a huge ceremony, and I'm certainly not against cremation myself or burial. I'm mildly against embalming personally, but that I don't think that's a sticking point. But I do think that showing proper honor and respect is essential to a people who believe that human beings are made in the image of God and are meant to be his image bearers on earth. And I fear that some of the cavalierness we're having in approaching death nowadays might be a consequence of the loss of our belief of the unique sacredness of humanity. But I could be reading in, it might just be about money. And for that, I understand. I've worked with many people. I couldn't believe how expensive it would be to do a funeral. And I completely understood why they didn't do it. But there are ways, to honor and have something that's not going to cost a phenomenal amount of money.
Right.
Certainly for us, I don't charge anything for a funeral. I mean, of course, if people want food and stuff, they're gonna have to buy food. I mean, that's what they want to do. But I don't charge for my services, and we don't charge for the use of the building for our people either. So we just want to give people a good, honorable end and hold them with the same dignity we believe all people deserve in life.
Right.
In death.
That's so valuable too, because it reflects in the world that image. It also reflects the character of God in that, where so many people. I used to, when I was young, we lived right next to a cemetery. There were kids that would go in there and pick over the gravestone and just respect. Always had a deep respect for some of those were soldiers from the Revolutionary War.
Yeah,
people were kicking over their graves, stones. That is appalling.
Yeah, not because those people are any greater than any other people in my view, but because they're people. They're human.
Right.
And human beings deserve a certain level of respect, however they've lived.
Right.
It's just a way of remembering that we're sacred. I'm not saying we're more important than animals. If anything, we were made to serve the created world. So I'm not saying that we're more important in that way, but I think sometimes we've forgotten. I think in some ways, modern scientism and humanism has diminished the value of humanity, and you can see it displayed in some strange places like funerary practices. Yeah, you can see. Well, thank you, Minister Joe. This is it's a challenging passage. Next time we talk, we'll be discussing one that's more familiar to people with the marriage of Isaac and Rebekah, and I think we'll have a lot to talk about in that.
Oh, yeah.
But we'll remember this, right? We'll remember the math that when Isaac does get married, it's after his mother has died, and he's nearly 40.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's old in some cases, but young compared to she's 127. So
Yeah, there's no doubt that the patriarchs are still living a long time. This seems to be a hangover from the time before the flood. You see these really long lifespans before the flood, 800, 900 years. Even Noah lives, 700, something like that. So they have long lives, but it's getting smaller and smaller.
right.
So, but still 40, it's late. I mean, most people don't believe Jesus even reached that age.
Yeah. Well, even in our culture today, 40 is older to be having kids.
Yeah. So anyway, I don't know if we'll make a big deal out of why he waited so long. Maybe it's just because of the expected old age and things like that. But I guess if your father had a child at 99, he wasn't in no rush.
Yeah. Or he was still frustrated or might not come home for a while.
Yeah. We're still going to wrestle with the lingering effects of Mount Moriah on Isaac's psychology. So, but thank you, Minister Joe. Any final words for the folks?
Well, we just want you to know that God honors faithfulness. I think that's something to say at the end of this and goal here that they had a long marriage, a lot of difficult things to face, but God brought them through as they were faithful. Used their circumstances to show more of his mercy and grace.
Yeah. And Abraham proves to have learned a lot, right? He wasn't exactly faithful to his wife in some ways, like when he lied about her identity so he could spare himself Abimelech and Pharaoh and things. But as they grow together, as they make a covenant together, as they have Isaac as this miracle child, as they raise him together, they're faithful all the way through, despite all those things that could have ended their relationship. They stick it all the way through, and Abraham sees her all the way into even negotiating a difficult negotiation and a costly one with some Hittite rulers to make sure even her burial is appropriate. So this is love. We think of it as emotion, but it's about this faithfulness over time that real love is shown. It's chesed in the end.
Yep, loyalty.
Yeah. And Abraham does prove eventually to be someone who puts Sarah first.
Right. Meanwhile, you need to be faithful too. We all need to be faithful.
Be faithful.
Thanks to your faith.
That's right. Well, thank you, everybody. We'll see you next week.